From the conquest to Confederation to the Constitution, the history that divides us. Hello. As we continue our national forum on remaking Canada, one of the questions in trying to solve our Canadian dilemma is, as a nation, who are we? Often you start to answer that question by looking back into history. A nation's identity is shaped in large part by its past. But in Canada, there is no shared view of where we come from. How this country came into being is hotly debated. Tonight, senior correspondent Brian Stewart examines some important misperceptions as Canada's two founding people clash on their understanding of our history.
Quebec people are a people, and they are quite entitled to behave like a people and request to be treated as such.
The vision of Macdonald and the Fathers of Confederation was clear. They sought not the perpetuation of the two-nation problem.
This is a country that can't even agree on recent history. How we got a constitution, what deals were made or betrayed. Flip back through time. Quebec and the rest of Canada have quite different views of our key moments, in peace and in war. Different heroes. Even a different sense of confederation. Memories that differ and divide right back to the conquest of 1759. So it all comes back to here, the Plains of Abraham at Quebec City, where a very short battle, fought 237 years ago, still divides our view of Canada. I, a product of English Canada, was taught long ago that one of the most brilliant battles of all time forged here the cradle for the eventual birth of Canada. It was the beginning, and the fields here were revered as a site of victory. But of course, for many in Quebec, it's the site of the violent defeat and conquest of an older nation that is still remembered and mourned here with real pain. The conquest is a political symbol that still to this day cuts to the very heart of Canada's unity crisis. It was, all agree, one of the most decisive battles in history. And September 13, 1759 is still studied worldwide in military academies. First scaling the rugged cliffs before Quebec, British troops under General Wolfe took only 15 minutes to shatter French forces and doom French hegemony in North America. Though he died in the battle, Wolfe's action would lead within a year to British conquest of New France that stretched across much of what's now Canada and the United States. But this wasn't just the defeat of France. That's the dilemma for Canada. For also conquered were the French-speaking settlers called les Canadiens. The first British commanders quickly saw what many later forgot, that these rugged Canadian settlers of New France had evolved over 150 years into a quite distinct people, or nation. Wolfe's successor even called them the best and bravest race on earth. They would not assimilate or go away. And after the Plains of Abraham, their descendants would always stand apart.
The reality is that in 1759, there were winners and there were losers. Why is it called the Quiet Revolution?
For 3 decades, Ramsay Cook has been one of Canada's leading historians. He says English Canadians have to understand the core reason for Quebec's endless demands for a special place.
I think the whole history of French-Canadian nationalism has been an effort to get rid of the conquest. What the referendum was about in 1980, and again in this past one we've had, is in a sense saying, do you want to end the conquest? That could be the question. Maybe we in English Canada would even accept that as a direct enough question. But that's what their history's about, and that's what they feel it's about.
It's clear that from a Quebec perspective, it has never been accepted. When you are conquered, it's not easy to accept.
Nationalist author Christian Dufour, who wrote the enormously influential book A Canadian Challenge, argues Quebec is still struggling to escape from a structure of conquest.
You can be defeated, have a terrible defeat, but you can always hope that you will have another victory that will reverse the situation. But conquest, it's a permanent defeat. It's an institutionalized defeat.
People keen on the...
And that's why other Canadians cannot relate to Quebec's frustration, says Susan Mann, president of York University and author of Dream of Nation, about the great tides of Quebec nationalism. Non-Quebecers simply have no frame of reference to understand the trauma of conquest.
Oh, you must absolutely look back at that. You will not understand the French-Canadian, the undercurrent of desire for a separate entity, a nation of their own, which would defy history. And so you're up against a real myth. Can one undo history? And Lucien Bouchard and René Lévesque before him, and then much more minor people politically before them, saying, yes, you can undo history. Now, this is powerful stuff, because you can't, of course, undo history. But if your politicians are suggesting you can, then they may well be able to pull on something very, very profound.
Quebec's very motto, I remember, expresses the depth of feeling about that old society before conquest. Stressing its virtues, nationalists note that early Canadians, unlike Anglo-American colonies, recognized Indian nations at the time as independent and did not wage war to seize their territories. The characteristics that set this society apart are passed down in stories from generation to generation. Even today, celebrated writer Jacques Godbout is revisiting the conquest theme. He's producing a new film on it for the National Film Board, another addition to the collective memory.
If you don't know what happened on the 13th of September, 1759, you don't know why we're arguing in Canada about the French, the English, Quebec, and whatever. If you look at today, it's very interesting to see that we have a memory, because in fact, history is nothing but a memory. I'm going to tell you when you're 5, 6 years old and 10 years old and so on, I'm going to tell you stories. Those stories become your memory. And through that memory, you will start on as a citizen, and you will vote this way or vote that way, because those stories sort of make your mind. That's what we call the imaginaire collectif, the collective imagination. That story that you're told depends on your family, depends on the school you went to, it depends also on your people.
After conquest, French Canada's fear of cultural extinction is the common theme linking flashpoints of Canadian history. The reason the past seems less remote to Quebec and also different. For example, the anti-imperialist rebellions in 1837. The rebels of English Upper Canada fought for political freedom, but those of French Lower Canada for national freedom. Both rebellions failed, but English Canadians often overlook how brutally the French rebels were suppressed. More than 300 killed, thousands jailed or driven into exile. It would be the last attempt at armed separation.
I would say that the failure of the rebellion is probably as important as was the defeat of 1760 and maybe more.
Social historian Gérard Bouchard is the brother of Lucien, Quebec's separatist premier. He believes the failure to win freedom left Quebec with a crippling legacy of fear and distrust.
Should have the rebellion succeeded, it would have put an end to the attempt to protect the culture, and at the same time it would have remove the impact of the defeat of 1760. And it would have been much easier for the two communities to talk together and to look for common arrangements and compromise.
To Bouchard, 1837 launched a century of two solitudes in Canada. English Canada looking forward and outward. French Canada backward and inward.
The only attitude that they felt appropriate to survive was to be protective, to be negative towards the future, and to renounce their dream to be a normal society. And I think this was, for a century, it had a tremendous impact on this society. It has prevented it from developing normally, from taking advantage of the changes that were occurring on the continent and so on.
Well, I think what the suppression of the rebellion taught them was that that was no way to go. I mean, that this was a no-win proposition.
But Ramsay Cook notes another impact. It gave birth to Quebec's remarkable political survival skills.
So the route to go was the political route, to use the power of their numbers in the political system to try to defend their rights. And I think that's the route that they went, and I think that they've done it brilliantly. I mean, we in English Canada think that all this stuff about, well, we'd like to be separate, but we'd also like to have association. You know, we'd like to have our cake, and we'd also like to eat it. I mean, I don't think that's really so surprising. I think that's the whole history of Quebec. And it's a history of a society that understands that the best way to go is a little bit at a time until you eventually get all that you want.
Quebec's political skills were immediately tested in the rebellion's key aftermath, Lord Durham's report. Durham is hailed in English Canada for advocating representative government, but is vilified in Quebec for urging the assimilation of all French Canadians into English culture. That assimilation threat, real and imagined, has been the rallying cry for nationalists down to today.
I mean, it's just horrendous stuff to read this Lord Durham, and it gives the shivers to any Quebecois student reading it now. Still gets the shivers. The problem is nobody then teaches the young French Canadian what actually happened afterwards.
And what happens is not assimilation, but confederation, an act of compromise and conciliation. Francophone voting power and political skill won language rights and gave Quebec leaders enormous clout in the new nation. By building power alliances nationally, leaders like Georges-Étienne Cartier could not be taken for granted. His support for Confederation was vital to Canada's birth. Quebec only narrowly agreed to join, and on what terms we're still debating 129 years later. Remarkably, no minutes were kept of the negotiations, and French and English came away with dramatically different interpretations. You can actually see the difference in the media on the very morning of Canada's birth. This is the actual Globe newspaper, forerunner of the Globe and Mail, that rolled off the presses in the early hours of July 1st, 1867. This informed voice of English Canada, published by George Brown, one of the fathers of Confederation, has page after page of informed detail on the new country, but not a single word about special status for Quebec. To the contrary, we hail the birth of a new nationality, a united British America. Yet that same morning in Quebec, Francophones were reading in the influential newspaper La Minerve, the new constitution recognizes the French Canadians as a distinct and separate nationality. We constitute a nation within a nation. Since then, generations of Quebec nationalists have insisted Quebec have special status because Canada is a compact between these two nations, emphatically not a union of co-equal provinces.
So from a Quebec perspective, it was really a pact Right? It's a big. It's clear that historically, for the French Canadians of that time, it was a pact. It was a way of dealing with their fellow English-speaking Canadians. It was a pact. It was a real pact. But in English-speaking Canada these days, it has been completely forgotten that.
I can prove till I'm blue in the face, as I have done often enough, that there's nothing in the documents of Confederation that say this was an agreement between two cultures, two nations, two societies, or whatever. Okay.
Ramsey Cook, a Federalist, says Quebec's claim is part misunderstanding, part sheer invention.
It's their way of trying to work out a system in which you don't count individuals because there are always more English Canadians than there are French Canadians. You don't count provinces because there are always more English Canadian or non-French Canadian provinces than there are French Canadian ones. You count nations, and then you get right down to 1 to 1.
It's very difficult.
But Susan Mann thinks the truth lies somewhere in between. French Canada was seen as a cultural nation, if not a political one.
What did Confederation mean? Where was it two peoples coming together, or was it purely a political, geographic, economic coming together? Is it a political structure? Is it a cultural connection? And the difficulty is that Canada is both those. So that ability to do both is the real magic of Canada, but it does create a bit of mental confusion.
And there was a profound shift in Quebec from cultural to political nationalism in the next flashpoint, the execution of Louis Riel in 1885. We tend to forget that Quebec thought Confederation meant French would ultimately dominate in the West as much as English. But the defeat of the French-speaking Métis shattered that pan-Canadian dream. Even Quebecers who had not supported his rebellion demonstrated in fury at Riel's execution. The nationalist Honoré Mercier denounced it as a declaration of war on the influence of French Canada in Confederation.
This would be the talk of the family in the evening and between the neighbors, and it was very important, the sense of betrayal. And from there, I think that the Confederation was never redeemed, was never redeemed.
It is from this point that successive Quebec leaders would project the province as the only safe homeland for French Canadians, their political as much as cultural nation.
With the hanging of Riel, there's a huge outcry in Quebec, and the view is that, you see, outside of Quebec, we are not going to be safe. And Quebec is going to have to be the guardian of French-Canadian interests.
These deeper implications of the Riel Rebellion are not fully recognized outside Quebec.
Who are these Métis? What does it mean to be Métis?
In Toronto's multi-ethnic downtown core, high school students get only one brief lecture on Riel. Teacher Alan Skio students are unsympathetic.
How many in this class would have executed Riel? Is there anyone who wouldn't? The question of killing him still divides Canadians. If I could take you into Quebec right at this minute, into a classroom in Quebec, I would predict this would be interpreted differently.
And indeed, it is seen differently. In the Lac-Saint-Jean region, Riel still has deep meaning for the students of teacher Jacques Vaillancourt.
Si vous aviez à décider, est-ce que Riel, d'après vous, serait pendu?
Non. Non. Tantôt, la question que tu as posée, là, si on le pendrait aujourd'hui, Riel, là. Non, mais d'après moi, il faisait juste défendre les intérêts de sa province.
Il faut l'enseigner parce que c'est quand même, ça s'inscrit dans une longue lutte des francophones du Québec. L'affaire Riel, c'est ce qu'on appelle un événement là, chaud. Je veux dire, c'est un événement dont on ne peut pas parler d'une façon neutre.
So the divide of history has run through our national life like a fault line from the beginning. When we return, thoughts on the clash of history in modern times.
Vive le Québec libre!
As the 20th century began, not only history, but basic worldview divided Canada. English Canada, proud offspring of empire, would continue to gaze outward, while Quebec looked inward, neither part understanding the other. It is said modern Canada found its soul in the searing agony of the First World War, and its most sublime mission in the liberation victories of World War II. Defining Canadian moments. But while many French Canadians fought bravely in the wars, Quebec's society, conservative and isolationist, resisted conscription and full involvement.
Collectively, Quebecers didn't want to go to that war because it saw it as a British war.
Writer Christian Dufour even finds our Poppies and Remembrance Day a foreign concept.
The 11th of November, the Remembrance Day. People in English-speaking Canada, everybody, they have the small flower. And in Quebec, it's there too, but not that much. I never wore that. Personally, I don't know. It's because that's part of my tradition. It's like the symbol idea of the conscription of something like that. I'm not saying that every Quebecer is like that, but it's clear that in Quebec, it's not a big moment than in the rest of Canada.
But by the 1960s, Quebec's quiet revolution and growing Canadian self-confidence seemed ready to combine in something new. The centennial is remembered as a golden moment. What has happened since will be debated for decades and take volumes to condense. But nationalists believe Prime Minister Lester Pearson was moving towards a two-nation Canada. Pierre Trudeau reversed that, and they claim everything since has been betrayal.
Mr. Trudeau has killed this momentum and has changed completely the Canadian political agenda and has brushed aside this endeavor towards a two-nation idea.
Many Quebec nationalists, however, fail to understand the changes in modern Canada, which has had to recognize the place of Aboriginals as co-founders and embrace individual rights and multiculturalism. Squaring all this with Quebec aims is the intractable problem.
Okay, I think English Canadians continue to think of their community as a collection of individuals, each of whom is equal. But French Canadians think of our common community, Canada, as not a group of individuals, but as two collectivities. And therefore, since they're a collectivity and we're a collectivity, we should divide things up a bit more equally than we have. Whereas English Canadians say no, democratic politics is about counting heads.
Plainly, people had a sense that you moved to another kind of medium, a higher kind of medium in which...
We get an interesting overview from Charles Taylor of McGill University, respected in both societies as one of the world's leading philosophers, who has long examined the myths that drive nationalism. He fears collective amnesia, for both French and English have so little notion of their history.
Even more surprising thing is that in the last few years, we've had a catastrophic collapse in our history teaching, so that very few people know any of those facts.
Taylor faults English Canada for still failing to grasp what makes Quebec so different.
The thing is that this is a people that does feel like a people that has felt itself to be a people, and it's never going to work in this country until that's recognized in the rest of the country. Now, I feel like the myth-making in English Canada, the rest of Canada, has just not prepared people to understand Quebec in these terms.
But Quebec historians have been irresponsible in ignoring the virtues of Canada.
The sense of not being recognized by English Canada has led to this reaction of saying we can do without them. And this is reflected in a lot of the historiography and this phenomenon you see among a lot of Quebec intellectuals, which I must say makes me very ashamed, that they know what's going on in Abidjan and in Paris and in Moscow and in Rome and in Florence and so on, but what's written in Toronto, they almost make a point of pride in having no knowledge of. That's a remarkable blind spot. The people that are most close by, the people with whom you've been interwoven in your history for 200 years are just not talked about.
Well, this is the theme of the two solitudes. And it is true that the intellectual community in Quebec do not have a very good knowledge of the intellectual productions on the English-Canadian side. It is true.
Gerard Bouchard concedes Quebec's tunnel vision and agrees Quebecers must now study Canada more.
And again, whatever happens with the political problems that are facing Quebec and Canada, I think we will still have to live as neighbors and hopefully as good neighbors. So in order to understand each other, it is very useful to know the history of each other.
We are always inventing ourselves.
Susan Mann says Canadians should take a long view. Remember that since the conquest, we've tried many ways to get along.
Confederation is very neat, and that's why it lasted so long. It's about number 7 in terms of attempts at how do you be French in North America, how do you be French and English in North America. A whole slew of experiments with that since the conquest. And Confederation is number 6 or 7, whatever, and it just happens to be the longest lasting one. So we should take encouragement from that. Clearly we figured out something right for about 120 years. But we should not take discouragement from the fact that it's now under question, because before Confederation there was a different model tried about every generation. So why not try another one?
Finally, one can wonder about the usefulness of history in overcoming national problems. The poet W.H. Auden, despairing about the conflicts of his century, once wrote, "History may say, alas, but it cannot help or pardon us." But in Canada, at least, it does seem we must better understand our different pasts if we're to have much hope in finding a common future. For The National, I'm Brian Stewart.